You already have things set up, so I'll just quickly run things here. We provided a job script for Scalasca or for FX10 that can be used. It's Scalasca 2, so the Scalasca 1 is the older version, which we're not using here. One thing to note is that the Scalasca analyzer and scan itself is running on the compute nodes. So this is, in our terminology, the back-end part. So it's a separate from the login nodes. And so we need to make sure that those executables are found on the path when we use them. You should see everything in here is very similar to the job script we were using before. We're setting a ScoreP filtering file as we did before. And we're defining a nexus here. So this is a prefix, just as you saw. There was a prefix to the compile command and compile and link command, which was for ScoreP. Here we're using Scalasca analyze as a nexus, as a prefix to the MPI exec. And that should be ready to run. Scalasca. So here, Scalasca analyze is running as a prefix to our MPI exec. This was the same executable file, the same ScoreP instrumented executable as we were using before. If you try and use this with an uninstrumented file, Scalasca analyze will tell you that it can't do a measurement because it hasn't been instrumented. There's a little bit of a peculiarity on the FX10 and K computer that we have difficulty capturing the output and showing it as part of the output, so we redirect that into a separate file. But the key thing to note is that it automatically came up with a name for the experiment archive that it's going to be using. It has the ScoreP underscore prefix to it. It has the name of the executable that was launched coming from here, and then the configuration, which in our previous example, we specified this manually. We said 8 processes and 4 threads per process. Here, the Scalasca analyze has defined that name for us automatically. So that was finished. There should be nothing very different that we see in here from what we saw before. We're doing the post-processing again with the Scalasca examine or square command. What we're seeing here would be identical to what we saw with ScoreP before we added the hardware counters to it. Don't want to do that. As a convenience for filtering and testing filters, we can ask for scoring to be done on our new measurement. So we just specify the directory again, not the files inside. Its square command is automatically running the ScoreP score for us. It's adding the -r and then saving the results into a file inside this archive directory. So this is the filtering output that we did manually before. Square -s will do that for us automatically. It's telling us that we need, when we want to do some trace collection, we need to have memory buffers on each process of at least 20 megabytes, and we can expect a trace file size of aggregate 91 megabytes. This is already filtered because we specified the filter in the job script. But otherwise, the contents of the directory here should be very familiar to you. We have the profile that was generated by ScoreP, the configuration that ScoreP was run with. Scalasca has saved a copy of the filter file that was used, so that's often convenient for you. I think that ScoreP is going to do that automatically at some point. I'm not sure if it does it already, but that's a copy of the filter that was used for the measurement. And we also have a copy of the execution output from the application, so that's saved inside the experiment archive for reference. We have the scoring report that we just generated, saved in here as well. And we have the summary file that was generated by the post-processing, so that was generated here. So that was basically doing the same thing that we saw earlier, using score P, perhaps in a little bit more convenient and more easy-to-use form with Scalasca. But we're now ready to go ahead and do some trace collection and trace analysis. So let's modify our Scalasca job script. What we're going to do is we're going to modify the analyze command. We're going to add an additional option. In this case, we're going to add the T option, which is to enable trace collection and analysis. You could also set the equivalent score P environment variable, that would be score P enable tracing. The other thing to note is that we need to specify a larger amount of memory. The default is 16 megabytes, if I remember correctly. That's not going to be enough in this case, so we'll specify 25 here. If you don't specify a larger amount, you'll probably find that when you do the measurement, it will contain some flushes. So I think we're ready to save that. If you're doing things yourself, try and change the total memory usage, and remember to add the -T here to use the trace collection and analysis. You'll notice that I didn't specify a new experiment archive. That's because I know that by default, when we do a trace collection measurement, it automatically gives a different suffix to the archive. So if in doubt, you can override this by specifying names of your own choice, but if you don't specify anything, Scalasca tries to come up with a reasonable default name, something a little bit more insightful than the time at which it ran. So we'll let that run. It should only take the 30 seconds, which it was doing previously. There's a warning here that we can ignore. The OTF print command that Scan is using is not available for the compute nodes, so that's not critical in this case. But basically, at this point, the trace collection was complete. It took 35 seconds, so that included the time to write the traces to disk. And then immediately after the trace collection, we have started the trace analysis. And the trace analysis means running MPI exec again, the same number of MPI processes. It will be using the same number of OpenMP threads, but instead of running the application, we're going to be running our trace analyzer, which is called Scout. And we're giving some arguments to Scout, including the name of the archive that it should analyze. The trace analysis itself has taken 55 seconds, but it's also now complete, telling us that the trace was actually 120 megabytes. So trace analysis is now complete. We can quit from this. If we take a look in the new measurement archive, we see there's a few more files in here now. So a lot of them are the same as before. We could have explicitly disabled profiling if we didn't want to collect another profile. The configuration and filter are always saved. We have two additional files of interest. Well, let me start first with the traces. So this is the trace data that was collected. These are actually definition files and anchor files for the trace data. The traces are actually in the subdirectory. So these are the different trace files in OTF2 format that were written, one for each of the threads of execution here. We also have a log file from the Scout trace analyzer. Basically telling us that it was analyzing this trace and giving us a little bit of a breakdown as to what it was doing as it went through, how much memory it required, etc. That's for our information, just to know that it ran and ran correctly. But more interesting is it produced a new trace analysis report. So, sorry. So we have our profile, and we also have the output from the Scout trace analyzer, which is a little bit larger because it contains additional metrics. If we run if we look at this file directly with Cube, or with Paraprof, for that matter, here on the left-hand side, we'll see a lot of extra metrics, such as the ones that were for late sender, weighted barrier, collective communications, etc. So these are a lot of additional metrics that were calculated by the trace analyzer that it was possible from the trace analysis, but are not possible from the basic profile itself. There's no structure here. For that, we will run the Scalasca examine, or the square command. It's going to post-process the analysis reports that it finds and create a little bit more structure here on the left-hand side with these additional metrics. So at first instance, first glance, the time metric may look very similar. We still have a negligible amount of time in MPI and a fairly low amount of overhead in OpenMP. The green highlight here is telling us that there's some additional trace metrics that were calculated that are further down. So here are our late sender, late receiver metrics that were calculated from the trace analysis. Down to this level, the information was available in the basic profile measurement. These additional metrics highlighted are the additional metrics coming from the trace analysis that require correlating information across the different processes, and that is expensive to do at runtime, so we do it as part of the post-mortem trace analysis. This time I hope I can get some documentation. Okay, right-click to bring up document for the different metrics, gives us a description of the metric, how it's calculated, and some ideas as to what it means and how you might want to compare other metrics and get more information about understanding what was going on there. That was the late sender. If we have a weighted barrier, it tells us how that was calculated, waiting time before the last process enters the barrier. In this execution, we also had some OpenMP synchronization metrics calculated. So there's a similar weighted barrier here for the implicit barrier synchronization. So here we're getting a breakdown of the time in the barrier from the waiting time. The waiting time is a measure of the imbalance in the barrier that's a bit more accurate, a bit more precise than the entire time in the barrier itself. Likewise for the point-to-point communication. Of the 4.76 seconds that was for sends, receives, and waits, a large proportion of that was actually attributed to the late sender pattern. A relatively small proportion of it is the basic MPI transfer time itself, the part that's not attributed to the late sender condition. For things like collective operation, it should be no surprise that almost all of the time in the collective barrier synchronization is waiting time. But for the point-to-point, there's usually more of a difference. And if I was interested in knowing where these are, I just follow the hotspots and find which call paths they're on and how they vary across the compute nodes, and the processes and threads, or processes in this case. You'll also notice that there's some additional markers here. So as well as aggregating the time in late sender or all these other patterns, there's some additional statistics that were calculated. These are also available here. So it's showing the variation of late sender time, So that all of the different instances are now being compared here. The time is very small, so it's not so significant in this case. If I look at the statistics just calculated here, I'm not getting the ones for this all reduced, but for this wait all, but just for this call path here. So I right-click here, see the maximum severity information. It tells me which rank was affected. It tells me exactly when in the execution this occurred. In this case, it's telling us 2.3 seconds into the execution, and it had a duration, in this case, of a tenth of a second. So that's the most severe instance that it is reporting here. This is the sort of information that can be used to direct a trace visualization tool, and I'll just show you this briefly with Vampire. In principle, you could use Paraver or some other tool to look at the trace and see this. Vampire is not a focus of the workshop here because it's not licensed, but we have a demo version installed, so I can look at the trace with Vampire. At the top here, we have the 30 seconds of execution. Those 30 seconds are also shown in the timeline view here, where we're seeing what's happening on each process and thread. If I squeeze things up, I can probably see all of the processes and threads in one view. So here are the 8 processes. We see that they all start executing MPI, and then they go into the parallel regions, which go through a number of iterations. If I zoom in here, I can focus on particular iterations of the 200 or so that are executed by the benchmark. As we get closer, in terms of zooming in, here we can see a collective operation. That's a wait all. Actually, the collective operations are only at the end, but here for each timeline, we're seeing when it's executing MPI, which is shown in red here, and we're seeing the message exchange between the processes shown by the diagonal line. So this is all the event detail that's captured and stored in the event trace. Scalasca Trace Analyzer is processing all of this, going through all of these events, doing a parallel replay to replay the sends with additional sends, the receives with additional receives to calculate these additional weighting metrics, and then calculate the severity of them and generate a summary report as a result. These blue parts here correspond to weighting in the parallel regions. So here we're seeing 3 of the threads completed the parallel region and had to wait for the 4th thread, in this case the master thread, to complete. There's a more severe instance down here. And we see that a lot of the parallel regions are actually very, very efficient with very little waiting time. Others have more of an imbalance and more waiting time as a result. So I think that is enough for the Vampire trace analysis. There's a demo license for up to 128 processes or threads here, so you can try it out yourself, but make sure that you don't run extremely large configurations because it will only handle 128 threads in the demo configuration. Was there anything that I missed in the cube display from Scalasca? Yeah. We were looking at the additional severity metrics here in the collective and point-to-point communication and in the OpenMP. This idle threads metric, which was also available in the trace analysis, I'll show you. Here we're concerned about the fact that some of the time is outside of parallel regions, and when we're outside of a parallel region, we're not executing using all of the cores that are allocated for the job. So here we're looking at part of the execution where we're doing some serial computation. We then go into the parallel region. We're using, in this case, 3 of the threads. So those 3 threads execute the parallel region. And then once they complete it, we return to serial execution. So we have idle threads for the threads that are not used for the parallel region. We have idle threads for those threads that are only executed outside of the parallel region here before and after its execution. So all of that time is an indication that we're wasting cores that were allocated to the job that we were executing here. So it should be no surprise that anything that's executed serially, anything that's executed only by anything that's executed outside of a parallel region shows up as idle threads time. One obvious manifestation of that in this case is that MPI time, here we're seeing 4 seconds of MPI time in await all on the master threads, 0 time on the other threads, but if we look at the idle time, we'll see that idle time is showing up for the threads that are not executing that MPI await all. The master threads execute the wait all. The other threads are idle for that time. If we combine both metrics together, then they're all executing the same amount of time. So the idle threads is also a good indication of which parts of the code are not executing efficiently in parallel. Some additional metrics that we can look at here. And one of the new metrics is a calculation of the critical path. Again, calculated from the trace analysis. So the critical path of execution is the part that dominates the application performance. If we, in this case, we were executing foo on rank 2 here, we then initiated a communication to rank 0, and then execution continued, completed the receive, and then continued with bar on rank 0, and then it did ascend to rank 1 and finished some computation here. So from the trace analysis, we can actually look through the events in the trace. We can actually work back from the MPI finalize, from the exit, see what was the last operation to complete. So the dashed lines are waiting. Those are not part of the critical path. Here we were executing the BAS routine. The thing that was dominating, that was preventing BAS from starting earlier on rank 1 was this communication. So we follow that back. That means that the critical path transfers to rank 0 and was this bar routine. And if we follow it back, that was waiting for foo here. So there was a receive here. Part of it was waiting time. Part of it was actually the completion of the receive. This was then the send that was blocking, preventing that receive from completing, and then execution of foo. So the critical path is important because if we can reduce the time here in foo, then we can reduce the critical path. If we reduce the time in bar here, if we reduce the time in foo here, it will have no benefit for us whatsoever. It will just mean that we spend more time waiting here. These are not on the critical path. We can reduce the time in them to 0. It will just mean that we spend all the longer waiting here before this receive can complete because the critical path is elsewhere. So knowing what's on the critical path and what amount of time is on the critical path, that helps you identify where you should focus your optimizations. No surprise, in this application, most of the critical path is in the different solve routines and in the parallel region inside them. The rank that's on the critical path might be helpful for you. Sometimes it's not. It depends how you can move the computation around between MPI ranks or between threads. What's more interesting is not just the time on the critical path, but the proportion of that time that is attributed to imbalance between the operations on different threads, resulting in potentially extended time on the critical path. So this 3.73 seconds on the critical path is time where the process on the critical path was spending longer than the others. If we go back to our diagram again, here we can see that each of the 3 ranks is executing the bar function. Only this part of its execution was on the critical path on rank 0. But by comparing the time in bar on these other ranks, that might indicate that there's an imbalance here that could be resolved by redistributing some of the time that rank 0 was taking in bar, giving some more work to these other ranks that they could use, so that the time spent in bar itself on rank 0 is reduced and the critical path as a result is reduced. There's a few other metrics that I'll let you explore as you wish. I don't think we need to go through them right now. When I'm here, I'll just check and see if we can get some source information. So you'll notice as part of the parallel regions, they actually identify the source file and the line number. I think that if I have the source file available, okay, here the highlighting is a bit unfortunate, but it's highlighting the parallel region and bringing up the browser. So again, if you build and run with -G, the source information allows us to determine how to get to the source files and how to show those. If you know your source files, you can presumably find them yourself. I think that's probably about as much as I think I need to cover here. Let's see what's in the slides. We redid the summary measurement and the filtering. Reminder that you need to have the backend defined within the job files, so that it defines the executables there. We did the Scalasca analyze with the -S. It created a new measurement. We then moved on to do the trace collection, adding the -T option, specifying the size of the trace file the trace buffers that we needed. If you add additional hardware counters, then that will also require additional memory. So in this case, if you add, in this case, 2 hardware counters, you need to increase this as well. The Scorpy score can also give you some idea of how much additional space you require for that, at least for the hardware counters. The trace analysis, the additional metrics that are shown, the context help, and the statistics. So that is the end of the Scalasca sites that we have here. Give it a try. Let us know how you get on with your own applications. And I think that there's no more that we need to present in this morning session. If you have specific questions or things that we should go into in more detail, we can do so, but that should be the basic information that you need to be able to try things out yourself. By the way, did you get the traces collected yourself and analyzed with Scalasca? If you had some problems with that, then let us know, and we can give you some assistance. But otherwise, I think you can continue working on your own application, or you can go for lunch.